A dangerous wall of weather is about to break across the United States, and what makes this setup so unusual is that it's all happening at once. On one side of the country, a brutal dome of heat is expanding over the middle of the nation, pushing temperatures toward 115 degrees. On the other side, a conveyor belt of severe thunderstorms is lining up to hit the same general regions again and again, with damaging wind, large hail, flash flooding, and a tornado threat that could grow as the weekend gets closer. And there's one quieter detail in the background that almost nobody is talking about yet. One piece of this pattern that could take the whole setup from serious to genuinely dangerous over the next few days. So if you want to understand what's coming, where it's going, which day matters most, and why meteorologists are watching this pattern so closely, stay with me, because once you see the shape of this setup, the whole forecast starts to make sense. The easiest way to picture this is to imagine a giant dome of hot air parked over the central and southern plains. That dome is acting like the lid on a pressure cooker. Underneath it, places like Kansas and Oklahoma are baking in extreme heat. But around the edge of that lid, the atmosphere is churning, and that edge is where thunderstorms keep firing. So while one part of the country is dealing with dangerous heat, another part is bracing for repeated rounds of severe weather. That contrast is the heart of this forecast, and it's exactly why this pattern stands out. The immediate threat. Let's start with what's happening right now, because the first hit from this pattern is already underway. The main severe weather concern today stretches across parts of the upper Great Lakes, from upper Michigan through Wisconsin and back into Iowa and northern Missouri. There's also a notable concern along the Mid-Atlantic corridor near Washington and Philadelphia, with low-end risk extending into southern New England and down toward northern Virginia. For most of these areas, the number one threat is damaging straight-line wind. These are the kinds of gusts that can snap branches, bring down power lines, and leave entire neighborhoods without electricity for hours. Large hail is also in play, especially across the high plains into South Dakota and Nebraska, where storms this time of year can quickly become tall, intense, and dangerous. Now here's the part I want to be honest about. On paper, today's tornado threat across the Midwest may not look especially impressive. But low risk does not mean zero risk. I'm watching a corridor from around Des Moines up towards central Wisconsin, and the Minneapolis area may be close enough to the edge of that zone to deserve attention too. Why? Because later this afternoon and into the early evening, low-level winds are expected to strengthen and shift. And when that happens, even a storm that looks fairly ordinary can briefly begin to rotate. That's the subtle detail that can turn a modest-looking setup into a warning-level problem in a hurry. So if you live anywhere in that region, make sure you have a reliable way to receive alerts today. Phone warnings, a weather radio, or a trusted local source, whatever your backup is, have it ready. Preparation costs nothing, regret does, but today is only the opening act. The real story is not one single day of storms. The real story is the persistence of this pattern. This is not one storm system rolling through and moving on. This is a setup that can reload. And if you understand the engine behind that, you understand why the next several days matter. A low-pressure system parked well to the north in Canada is helping strengthen winds both aloft and near the surface across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley. When you combine strong winds, deep moisture, and an unstable atmosphere, you get one of the classic ingredients for severe weather. In simple terms, instability is the fuel. Wind shear is the structure. And when you have a lot of both, storms don't just pop up and collapse. They organize. They intensify. And in the worst cases, they rotate. Now here's the twist that makes this setup even more interesting. For much of this pattern, the winds aloft are coming in from the northwest. But by the weekend, that flow is expected to shift more westerly. That may sound minor, but it matters a lot. Because once that happens, low-level winds can begin pulling in more from the south. And when winds near the ground come from the south, while winds higher up come from the west, you create the kind of turning in the atmosphere that supercells love. And supercells are the storms capable of producing very large hail and strong tornadoes. That's why Sunday stands out. Not because a tornado outbreak is guaranteed, but because the ingredients may be lining up. And when the ingredients are lining up 3 days in advance, you pay attention Friday. Today, Friday, the main focus is the Midwest and parts of the East Coast. Showers and thunderstorms are already developing across Minnesota and Iowa, and they're expected to become more widespread through the day. Damaging wind is the primary concern, with isolated large hail also possible. And as I mentioned earlier, I would not completely rule out a brief, isolated tornado if low-level winds strengthen enough late in the day. Along the East Coast, scattered storms are expected to fire from around the Cleveland and Columbus areas eastward through the evening. The main hazard there is damaging wind, with gusts potentially reaching around 70 miles per hour, plus some small hail. The tornado threat is low. But in a hot, humid August pattern, the atmosphere can still surprise you with a brief spin-up. Rare does not mean impossible. Farther south, a weakening cluster of storms over Oklahoma and Kansas this morning may be followed by a second round this afternoon. Their damaging wind up to around 60 miles per hour is the main issue. And in the desert southwest, monsoon moisture over Arizona and New Mexico could lead to flash flooding in vulnerable areas. Saturday looks like the quietest day of the stretch. And that's worth saying clearly, because not every day in an active pattern turns into a major event. The focus shifts to the interior northeast, especially Pennsylvania and New York, where scattered afternoon storms may bring gusty winds and isolated hail. The tornado threat remains low, but there may be a narrow window, roughly from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m., when a brief isolated tornado in central or eastern Pennsylvania cannot be completely ruled out. Those storms could track toward Allentown and eventually toward the New York City area through the evening before weakening overnight. So yes, Saturday may be the calmest day, but it may also be the pause before a much more important Sunday. Sunday, the highest ceiling. Sunday is the day that stands out the most in this entire forecast. And when I say Sunday has the highest ceiling, what I mean is simple. The most dangerous outcome is not guaranteed, but the potential is there. This is the day when upper-level winds and low-level winds may strengthen together across the upper Midwest. That creates an atmosphere loaded with both instability and shear. And that combination gets attention. The morning may begin fairly quietly, with only scattered showers or storms. But watch the afternoon. That's when an isolated supercell or two could develop. Parameters supportive of tornado potential may climb from parts of South Dakota into southern Wisconsin. And the instability values being discussed are eye-catching, with some areas in Minnesota and Iowa potentially seeing 4,000 to 5,000 units of atmospheric energy. Put simply, that is a lot of fuel. And when the atmosphere is that primed, storms do not need much of a push to explode. Some guidance suggests the most concentrated activity may set up across Wisconsin. Early to mid-afternoon could feature isolated supercells, and that would likely be the phase with the greatest hail and tornado concern. Later in the day, those storms may merge into a longer line, a mesoscale convective system, basically a coordinated wall of thunderstorms moving across the region. If that happens, cities like Milwaukee, Grand Rapids, and possibly even Detroit could be dealing with severe weather overnight into early Monday. In that later stage, damaging wind would likely become the main threat, while hail and a tornado or two would be more likely earlier in the storm cycle. And I want to keep emphasizing one word here. Good. We are still far enough out that smaller details will matter. So the potential is real. The ceiling is high. But the exact outcome is still uncertain. That's not hype. That's honest forecasting. Early next week, the threat keeps going. And the pattern doesn't simply end after Sunday. If anything, it keeps grinding. Monday may shift the severe focus into Indiana, Ohio, and possibly Illinois, with significant wind potential and perhaps a tornado or two. Tuesday could reignite the storm threat a little farther west, across Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois, with the broader concern potentially extending back toward West Virginia. And this is where a quieter danger starts to emerge. Flooding. When multiple rounds of storms train over the same places day after day, rainfall totals start adding up quickly. At that point, the threat is no longer just the storm itself. It becomes the water left behind. That is one of the biggest things to watch in the Ohio Valley through the middle of next week. Some forecast guidance is hinting at widespread rainfall totals of 3 to 7 inches, with isolated higher amounts possible. Other guidance is more conservative, showing more of a 1 to 3 inch range. That disagreement matters. It means flooding is not locked in. But when reliable guidance starts showing that much rain over a populated region, you pay attention. Even the low-end totals could cause real issues if the ground is already saturated from repeated storms. The storms are only half the forecast. The other half is extreme heat. The central and southern plains remain trapped under that dome of hot air, and the temperatures are serious. Parts of southern Kansas and northern Oklahoma may push toward 115 degrees. And to be clear, that is not the heat index. That is the actual air temperature. By Saturday, the heat expands into South Dakota and Nebraska, with highs well into the triple digits. By Sunday and Monday, it may become even more intense. Central Kansas could be looking at highs around 112, while places like St. Louis may climb to around 101. And this is not a one-day spike. This is stubborn heat that may hold into Tuesday or Wednesday before finally breaking. It's worth repeating that heat is one of the deadliest forms of extreme weather. It does not always get the dramatic footage that tornadoes and hurricanes do. But it kills quietly. If you live in that region, check on elderly neighbors. Stay hydrated. Avoid the hottest parts of the day. And never leave a person or a pet in a parked car. This is not the kind of heat you simply tough out, and here is one of the most striking parts of this setup. After the heat peaks, a strong cold front is expected to sweep through the Midwest and Great Lakes around the middle of next week. And the temperature drop behind it could be dramatic. Low temperatures across Minnesota and Wisconsin may fall into the 50s, the 40s, and in parts of northern Minnesota, even the 30s. Think about that for a second. A region that was part of a country baking near 115 degrees could be talking about 30s just days later. That kind of temperature spread across one nation in 1 week is remarkable. And it perfectly captures why this pattern is so unusual. It's not just heat. It's not just storms. It's both colliding in the same large-scale setup. For growers in northern Minnesota, those chilly readings are worth watching. The good news, at least right now, is that a hard freeze does not appear to be immediately on the table. But it is a reminder of how quickly the season can start shifting once patterns like this begin to break down. there's one more part of the national weather picture that deserves attention. The tropics. Right now, the Atlantic is unusually quiet. And the reason is clear: El Niño. El Niño tends to increase wind shear across the Atlantic, and that shear tears apart developing tropical systems before they can organize properly. So while parts of the Pacific may stay active, the Atlantic has remained notably calm. At first glance, that sounds like good news. Fewer storms forming means fewer immediate coastal threats. But there is a catch. A quiet season is not the same thing as a safe season. When the Atlantic stays this quiet for this long, ocean heat energy keeps building. And if a storm later in the season manages to break through the hostile environment, it could strengthen quickly. Sometimes all it takes is one storm. History has shown that even a quiet season can still produce a devastating hurricane. So yes, the calm is good news for now. But it is not an all-clear signal, so here's the bigger picture. A massive dome of heat is anchoring itself over the central and southern plains. Along the northern edge of that heat dome, the storm track is lining up, and that zone is becoming a repeated target for severe thunderstorms. As winds shift and strengthen into the weekend, Sunday begins to stand out. After that, the pattern may continue reloading into early next week, while flood concerns quietly grow in parts of the Ohio Valley. Then comes a strong cold front, a dramatic temperature reversal, and a weather map that may look completely different just a few days later. This is not one isolated event. It is a sequence. Dangerous heat, severe storms, possible tornadoes, growing flood risk, and a dramatic swing in temperatures, all inside roughly 1 week. That is why this setup matters. If you live anywhere across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, or the Ohio Valley, treat each afternoon and evening over the next several days as a time to stay weather-aware. Keep your phone alerts on. Have a backup warning source in case the power goes out. And especially heading into Sunday, know exactly where you would go if a warning is issued. If you live in the central or southern plains, the biggest threat may be the heat. Plan around the coolest parts of the day. Hydrate constantly. And check on the people most vulnerable around you. And if flooding becomes an issue in your area next week, remember the oldest rule in the book. Never drive into a flooded road. It takes far less moving water than most people think to sweep away a vehicle. I'll be tracking this pattern closely as the forecast sharpens. And if you found this breakdown helpful, subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me know in the comments. Out of all the threats in this forecast, extreme heat, tornadoes, flooding, or the unusually quiet tropics, which one concerns you the most, and why?